I feel that the posture of Rassemblement National has become considerably more conformist, I would say Malonian, over the last couple of years. Balanced budgets and Atlanticism. RN have conformed to that. He said, they need to sign up to this agenda. They already have.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustabia, on fait le bunga, bunga, Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Bunga Cast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. This is me, Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil, joined by fellow Bunga boy George Hoare in London. Hello.
Me, George Hoare in London.
Thou. Pronouns, thou, thine.
Which
we're informal here, so it should be thou, thine.
You can use the two informal pronoun with me. That's okay. You don't have to address me in the formal way. That's fine.
In the formal you, the informal thou. So J.D. Vance has killed the Pope. Frankie's gone to Hollywood. George.
Yeah, he has. I mean, there was a meme that you sent round, which I didn't get, but yeah, a fuck, marry, kill relating to the vice president. But yeah, he went and he did it. He went big and then he went home, or vice versa. But certainly, he got the Pope done, and good for him if that's what he wanted to do.
I saw someone referring to him having the cheese touch, which I assume is like the opposite of the Midas touch. Although I like cheese, so I don't see why that would be negative. I would like to be able to turn things into cheese. But that he then went to India, right? And then there was this massacre of tourists in Kashmir. So it seems like he's at least unlucky and potentially complicit.
But the cheese touch, I mean, the Midas touch doesn't turn things into Midas. So the cheese touch wouldn't necessarily turn things into cheese. I'm sorry to nitpick with this
fair.
Anonymous internet person. There's a football phrase that some of our British listeners will know that about having a bad touch, but I will not. I won't use it here because it's not very. it's not necessary to. Anyhow, yes.
That's mysterious. But anyway, so people will always have heard that the eulogies have been coming in from the Pope, including from all sorts of world leaders, all the pro forma stuff, as Branko Milanovic satirized. Typical statement by politicians at the death of Francis. I am so sorry at the passing of the Pope Francis, whose teachings on poverty, inequality, climate change, war in Gaza, war in Ukraine, billionaires, financial sector, divorce, etc., I have totally ignored. But I still learned a lot from him. Indeed. I mean, but the point about hypocrisy of world leaders is kind of the easy one. It's interesting also that Greg Grandin writes about, who's the U.S. historian of Latin America, writes of the late Pope in his new History of the Americas, which is just out, that Bergoglio, the Pope Francis, his street name, he grew up in Peronist Argentina as the poor were beginning to demand entrance into the political arena, living through his country's industrial expansion, its dictatorship, then neoliberalism's corrupt sell-off of industries, and the country's economic collapse at the start of the new millennium. As a consequence, Bergoglio felt that, here quote, no one can accept the premises of neoliberalism and consider themselves Christian. Neoliberalism corrupts democracy by denying the fullness and interdependency of humans by splitting what is whole asunder. Later, he'd go on to describe hypercapitalism as a system that devours everything that stands in the way of increased profits. All that is fragile, like the environment, is defenseless before the interests of a deified market. Some good stuff in there, some stuff that I would definitely question its interpretation. The idea of some original wholeness, which gets broken up, I don't think is quite right philosophically. But anyway, there's questions also about Bergoglio's conduct during the Argentinian dictatorship and the dirty war in the 70s. So, I mean, the main charge against him was that there was this kidnapping of two Jesuit priests who were taken in by Navy officers in May 1976 and then held under inhumane conditions for their missionary work with the poor. And the claim is that Bergoglio wasn't particularly active in preventing this from happening, and in fact, perhaps complicit because he withdrew his order's protection from the two priests, effectively giving the military green light for their abduction. Now, none of this is proven, and actually, anyway, I don't think the issue here is whether Bergoglio or indeed Pope Francis, that his record is that of a good leftist and humanist. I think what's more at issue is the left's embrace of the Pope, or at least of this Pope, as a good one, for having adopted progressive causes, caring about the poor, and so on. No.
Yeah, no, I think it's quite striking actually, and I know we're going to come on to some of the fictional portrayals of the Pope, but I guess it's what happened to the old anti-clericalism, the kind of the idea that the Catholic Church can't be saved, not because of some personal misconduct of individual priests or maybe systemically, but because religion is not an emancipatory force. I mean, I think people are going. I mean, maybe this is a wider turn in culture, including in quote unquote alt-lit circles. People are more sympathetic to the Catholic Church than I can remember for the last 20 years on the left, or on left and various allied bits of the culture, perhaps.
Yeah, no, totally. I think the secularization, which was taken for granted up through the through the 70s, 80s, probably even through to the 90s. Although already in the US you had the kind of neoconservative movements. Well, it reached its peak around then, so maybe that was already a moment in which people were thinking, maybe the secularization narrative isn't quite correct, or they wrote it off as American exceptionalism, which actually tended to be the answer from European observers. But nevertheless, what you observe today, I think, is three different ways, at least in Western cultures, in which secularization hasn't fully played out. One is this turn towards Catholicism. And I think there's certain appeal there because there seems to be something about authority. We've discussed this on previous episodes where we've dealt with
spectacle.
Yeah. We dealt with this in the episode towards the end of last year on Conclave. And I think we've done maybe we have touched on this in other moments, and I can't recall exactly when. But in any case, there's some appeal, a cinematic appeal of depicting the Pope as a symbol of authority, but also of Catholicism as having kind of some meaningful, ingrained tradition, liturgy, which you can follow, something kind of more weighty and meaningful and intemporal. And I understand why people might be attracted to that in today's day and age. But we're obviously aware of the problems with that. The other one is obviously the growth of evangelical Christianity, particularly in kind of more peripheral countries, where that seems to also be a strong challenge to the notion of secularization. You expected Catholics to go, and if some people would remain Catholic, and lots of Catholics would kind of lapse and become soft Catholics, and then eventually just become kind of secular people, atheist or explicitly atheist, or at least agnostic. And instead, what is happening? I mean, certainly you observe this in Brazil, and I have a piece on this, and we were going to do, I think, a series on dealing in part with this question, maybe at some point later this year, but what has actually happened is that a lot of Catholics, instead of becoming secular agnostics or atheists, have become evangelicals. So that's another way. And then the third way is the way that a lot of atheists have embraced spiritualism, or embraced all sorts of kind of magical and mystical beliefs to different degrees. We don't know how strongly held they are. But if we think about things like, even people will laugh if you use this as an example, but like astrology, right? That's another way in which it's a kind of a turn from rationalism, and perhaps in a reaction to an excessive rationalization of social life, in the search for something
and a lack of meaning. And you can find, it is a system of meaning, and whatever else it might or might not be, and maybe that's what people are striving for, and it partly explains the popularity of Catholicism to some, because it is a system of very heavy meaning. It's not the kind of the Protestants who are like, oh no, we don't need any of this, spectacle and tradition. We can just get by with just reading the Bible in our own language. No, you need something a bit more demanding, a bit more
right. And I probably have more time for the neo-Catholics on the left, indeed, including on the left, than I do for those who opt for off the peg, scrambled, mixed up, individualistic forms of religion. At least Catholicism promises, something social and collective to that form of belief and of worship. And there's various kind of indeed people from the Marxist tradition, including, I mean, probably foremost Mariátegui, the Peruvian Marxist, who wrote about the intermeshing of kind of religious beliefs about justice, and eventually people's kind of revolutionary commitments, and how one can't break these apart so clearly. And I have to admit, I'm a little bit ambivalent on the question. I haven't made my mind up. Maybe by the time we come around to doing
that's why we do a series on it.
Exactly.
Educate ourselves.
Exactly. So, but anyway, all this aside, I think the left's embrace of, us having a good pope is probably problematic and speaks to the left's weakness and need for a high-profile spokesperson for its causes, insofar as these causes are understood as poverty, injustice, oppression, and war. And we might like that. We might kind of go, well, it's better to have someone, acting as some form of moral authority, castigating world leaders for their failures and hypocrisies, than someone who doesn't and indulges them. But that's what I want to. That's what I want to query. I'm not sure that's right. And we can think of Jude Law and the young pope, which is great. I genuinely, the more the time goes on, the better I think that is. I've watched it twice, and I think it has an insight to it which is maybe belayed by the fact of its kind of presentation as a TV series, effectively. Jude Law on that, as we've discussed, I think, previously on this podcast, he's this aloof, ultra-conservative, traditionalist pope, in rebellion, actually, as we learn in the series, in rebellion against his hippie parents who abandoned him, which is, I think, very much to the point about today, right? We're all in some way children of the 1960s and the long tail of the new left and its transformation of institutions and subjectivity, and then there's a rebellion against it. So he is neo-trad. Jude Law in that series is neo-trad avant la lettre.
And he smokes, and all of the neo-trads smoke as well.
Nice.
And he's cool. I don't know if the neo-trads are cool as well, but yeah, it's just I think, as you were saying, it's more complex than it first appears, and that's partly because it's so beautifully shot, and Paolo Sorrentino knows how to make a good scene with all of this papish background.
Say what you want about the Italians, indeed. But, we might desire a progressive or liberationist pope, but is it what we need? I think the problem of authority today is of authority self-abnegation, a point that we've discussed a number of times on this podcast. No one's in charge. Only the only master is the market, which is really just a disaggregated collection of individual wills, some wills more powerful than others, but nevertheless. And the result of that is, on one level, popularism, right? Just kind of let the people, insofar as they're individuated consumers, decide, right? There's no kind of authoritative claim about the good and the right. The few affirmations, I think, of authority that you see today are either kind of cringe attempts at neo-trad, which we've already mentioned, or just exercises in barbarism, right? Getting things done at whatever cost. I think, Putin invading Ukraine could be one case of that. But I think probably if I'm thinking of Putin for some reason as a figure of authority, which I think a lot of the kind of neo-trads actually do, and certainly the neo-reactionaries have latched onto, his response to the 2002 Moscow theater hostage crisis. Do you remember this? I mean, this is a long time ago. But the response to that
remind me.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think something like 500 people were taken hostage in a Moscow theater, and the Russian security services intervened, releasing sleeping gas into the building, and then stormed it. But in doing so, they killed all 40 hostage takers, but 132 hostages died, mainly because of the effects of the gas. So this is decisive action. This is authority today, right? It seems to only take that kind of form.
Yeah, I'm not sure this is an example of authority. I mean, you have to distinguish authority and authoritarianism, but no,
but this is kind of what I mean. But that's what's held up as, in the absence of genuine authority, that's held up as kind of authoritative behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of authority is one of the central ones of our times.
Yeah, no, and so, I mean, when leftists talk about, this is the other example of kind of left indulgence of theocracy, for lack of a better way to put it, is that, people talk about, the true Jesus, as a way of shaming conservative Christians. But I don't know if, a progressive or even liberationist pope is what we need. Surely we'd be better off with Jude Law. We'd be better off with an aloof, authoritarian, traditionalist daddy. a worthy father to struggle against, rather than someone who we think is our mate. Anyway, at the end of the day, this is a little bit like U.S. citizens acting, or rather non-U.S. citizens acting like they are U.S. citizens, and discussing the elections as if they were Americans, like who we're going to vote for. Did you vote for Trump, or did you support Trump? It's like, well, I didn't have the chance to vote for him because he's not, I'm not a citizen of that country. And here we're not Catholic. And indeed, even if we were, we're not electors of the Pope. That's kind of the point. It's a theocracy. So we should, I think, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God, and concern ourselves with our Caesars, with earthly authority, and leave the Pope to the Popery. Anyway, one other observation about this month before we move on to the main theme of Lawfare. I made reference to this, I believe it was still on air in a recent episode, but speaking of barbaric acts meant to demonstrate authority, we can think of the deportation of Kilmar Abrego Garcia to a Salvadorian terrorism confinement center by accident. And I think that's one of the most dystopian developments of recent years. And there's probably quite a lot of competition for it. But for me, this has really stood out. There's obviously a history of U.S. coups and death squads across Latin America, and in El Salvador in particular. And in part, the growing force of organized criminal elements to which President Nayib Bukele is acting against in El Salvador, that's testament to a failure of capitalist development, and perhaps more specifically to U.S. imperialism in a much more direct sense. So all of that has created the ground for someone like Bukele to emerge, and for his policy of basically throwing huge swathes of the Salvadorian population in jail to garner some actual popularity in the country. And I would point listeners to a recent episode we did on this. It was maybe 14 months ago when we did an episode on Bukele. I would really urge people to check that out. I think a lot of people took a lot from that, really enjoyed it, and worth revisiting for sure. The link's in the show notes. But I think for the U.S. to export longtime residents to foreign jails is a new step. And probably more shocking still is to look at it from the other side. For a developing country to export not just raw materials, which itself is an index of underdevelopment, but to sell prison space to rich countries, as if that's its comparative advantage in a globalized free trading world.
Yeah, I mean, talk about reshoring. I mean, this is the opposite. Or maybe it's not. Maybe it's part of Trump wants to export more goods, produce in America, export more prisoners. Yeah, I mean, I do. I've heard some competing things about Kilmar Abrego Garcia, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. But it seems like this is the direction of travel is in the US is very much more to be, to be taking care of business. Maybe this is the temporary solution to the crisis of authority is going to be increasingly, spectacular acts which supposedly demonstrate authority and try to constitute it, but in fact maybe just reveal that it doesn't exist in the way that it used to. So being kind of self-undermining of that relationship between the governed and the governors, which constitutes sovereignty and builds authority. But yeah, I think I kind of took your point about
not at
free
all,
trading
no.
comparative advantage. I mean, maybe shouldn't be joking about this because it is, somebody who has been deported, and this is going to happen increasingly, you would imagine.
Yeah, no, and I mean it's in that regard, it's kind of a deepening of neoliberalism in the absence of the capacity to actually respond to what people who voted for Trump demanded beyond the immigration question. It's easy to reach for these authoritarian solutions, and it's notable, that the kind of carceral state in the U.S. expanded massively under neoliberalism, and although that has now gone into reverse, something like this would seem much more a continuation of the neoliberal era than a break from it, albeit kind of an acceleration of its worst tendencies. This is like the darkest globalization one could imagine. Anyway, on to the main theme of this episode. In the past month, Marine Le Pen, the leader of the radical right Rassemblement National in France, was banned from running for office for 5 years over an EU Parliament fake job scam. I'm sure you know this, listener of BungaCast, but she was effectively president in waiting. I mean, of all the radical right forces to come to power in European countries, this was kind of the big one that everyone in some ways has been waiting to happen in fear or expectation, but nevertheless, it's kind of the big one everyone's expecting. So this ban is very significant. It also won't have escaped your notice, I'm sure, listener, that this is a recurring theme in Western politics. So at the end of last year, the results of the first round of the election in Romania were annulled after a far-right candidate, Călin Georgescu, won, supposedly due to online misinformation campaigns, Russian interference, etc. You know the whole story by now. We're working on having an episode on this dedicatedly on Romania in the next week, so do keep an eye out for that. In Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro is now officially a defendant, along with some top generals, in a case in which they're accused of plotting a coup. And Bolsonaro has already been ruled ineligible for office back in 2023 by the Supreme Court. In Germany, a bunch of lawmakers are trying to argue for a ban on the AfD, the alternative for Germany, etc., etc. These are all cases of lawfare. It's something that we discussed in our book, which we started writing back in 2019 and came out actually in early 2021. And this was something that we were pretty explicit already at the time as being very much integral to the end of history, the collapse of establishment authority, and the kind of decay of democracy and democratic institutions, and the favoring of the judiciary, the pursuit of electoral ends through judicial means, and so on. So, because of all this, I thought I would call up a frequent guest, or regular guest. He's been on a bunch of times anyway. David Broder, who's the Europe editor at Jacobin and the author most recently of Mussolini's Grandchildren, Fascism in Contemporary Italy, to ask him about what's happened with Le Pen and what are the consequences of this. So I'm here talking to David Broder, and we're going to start off just by covering the basics, I think. What are the charges against Le Pen? How credible are the charges?
The charges against Marine Le Pen and 8 of her Rassemblement National colleagues are focused on the embezzlement and misuse of public funds in the European Parliament from 2004 up till 2016, in some accounts amounting to as much as 4 million euros worth of public funds that was meant to go to parliamentary assistance, meant to help members of the European Parliament with their work as legislators. And basically the story is, instead of using the money to pay people to work in Brussels and Strasbourg full-time, basically the money was used by the party to hire full-time party activists and even bodyguards. The sort of text messages, WhatsApp messages revealed during the case depict a conscious, deliberate breaking of the rules. Marine Le Pen and her colleagues deliberately picking party activists to serve as parliamentary assistants, but who would then never go to Brussels, would never work for the European Parliament as such, but work for the party. If you look at the depositions and the hearings in the case, Marine Le Pen is pretty open about this, that this was indeed what they did. They had the opportunity to hire parliamentary assistants in the European Parliament. They could do very little work, get very little done anyway, so they used them as campaigners. Her defense is much more premised on the idea that what they did was legitimate than somehow claiming not to, that the sort of basic facts of the case are somehow misrepresented or untrue.
Right. No, and this would be a fact which would be unsurprising to any kind of Eurosceptic around Europe, who would one of whose frequent criticisms heard of Brussels is that it's kind of this gravy train where you just have the generation of these kind of almost fake roles and whatever. I'm actually curious. Is there a slang for it in France? In Brazil, it exists. It's called laranjas, an orange. It's not really clear where that came from, but it's like the orange candidates, candidates which are on a fake name or fake assistants who've been hired with public funds and so on.
Nothing really comes to head in that regard for me. But
I'll have to investigate further. Very important.
I'm sure there is, and it's just not coming into my mind. But
yeah.
But I mean, of course, that's part of the story as well, right? Which is that no one. I mean, there's a great deal of hypocrisy on Le Pen's part in that she has often accused political opponents of parties living off the taxpayers' expense and has in the past herself called for harsh measures against politicians found guilty of misuse of public funds, including a ban from public office like the one she's had. But I mean, if in reality, I mean, in the European Parliament, it's absolutely chock full of people who are full-time party activists who are, put in positions funded by the taxpayer because they're party loyalists and they're doing politics. Le Pen herself said in the deposition, we're not elected functionaries. We're elected popular representatives in the European Parliament, and for long periods, including the period in question, her party wasn't even in a group. It had no right to table resolutions. Politically, had no chance of passing amendments. Their parliamentary work was bound to come to nil. So what she says, well, let's devote our resources to ensuring we get more candidates elected and have more influence next time. So, obviously I loathe her party and its political cause, but I think it's a bit naive or ingenuous, let's say, to pretend that this is some unique aberration from the norm. And, her hypocrisy doesn't really change the fundamental issue of principle, particularly for those of us on the left, where workers and communist parties have a very long tradition of treating their elected representatives as servants of the party, not as some sort of parliamentary official or elected functionary of the state.
Yeah, right, indeed. And I wonder, I mean, from my understanding is for her to be charged and for a leading politician in France to be charged is not exceptional, but the sentencing was perhaps a little bit exceptional, at least in terms of, as we're working towards having a discussion more specifically about lawfare and whether these charges against her are just or politically motivated and so on, and try to untangle that a little bit. I want to understand if it's the sentencing itself which was particularly harsh.
Well, the punishment for Le Pen is 2 years suspended imprisonment, 2 years actual imprisonment, but which you can do under house arrest with an ankle bracelet, big fine, and then this 5-year ban running for public office. Of all of those things, the only one that applies immediately is the 5-year ban on public office. So it's not like she has to start wearing an ankle bracelet right now. She can exhaust her appeals before the other penalties apply. So really the controversy in the sentencing revolves around this so-called exécution provisoire. So it's the immediate imposition of the 5-year ban on holding public office. It should be said that not all of the defendants in the case, even the ones who were found guilty, were subject to this. So, for example, Louis Alliot, who's the mayor of Perpignan, so that's like the biggest city in France that has a Rassemblement National mayor, he wasn't subjected to this immediate ban on public office. So, this type of penalty and its immediate imposition has been applied also to figures elsewhere on the political spectrum. So, for example, François Fillon, who was the main Gaullist candidate in 2017, or there's Hubert Falco, who was the mayor of Toulon. He had a scandal called Fridgegate, because after he stopped being a departmental councillor, he was still having them prepare meals for him at the taxpayer's expense, keep them at the fridge, deliver them to his house for years after he stopped being an official. So it's not only, I had a discussion with Glenn Greenwald and Yanis Varoufakis a couple of weeks ago, and Greenwald was kind of going hard on this is lawfare directed at the only sort of challenger to the establishment, and it's directed against the populist right. I think that's an exaggeration. I think it's not that unusual, but certainly it was very contentious. Also because, as we see from the judgment, it's not like the judges had to impose this immediate ban. So they have to take into consideration the gravity of the offences, what the impact will be on what they call in the judgment, reaching a kind of social consensus about the gravity of the crime. If the crimes were committed today, then they actually would, in most circumstances, have had to apply this penalty. But the crimes in question actually preceded the legal reform, which makes this a so-called obligatory sentencing requirement.
Right.
Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself, Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the BungaCast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/BungaCast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.
De A ou pas se taire.